Hurricane Milton makes landfall near Siesta Key, Florida, unleashing tornadoes, extensive flooding and knocking out power to millions of people. We'll have the latest on recovery efforts. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. Residents across Florida are assessing the damage after Hurricane Milton slammed the state with high winds, heavy rain and tornadoes. The powerful storm dropped record amounts of rain, resulting in flash flooding and trapping some people in their homes. Rescue operations are still underway. Winds clocked at 160 kilometers per hour ripped the roof of a baseball stadium and sent a crane crashing into a building in St. Petersburg. The storm left some 3 million homes and businesses without power. CGTN's Nitza Soledad Perez traveled to Siesta Key to survey the damage there.
Emergency crews are undergoing rescue operations in Hillsborough County in Clearwater. And at this time, close to 3 million people are without power. And this is especially impactful for a population that endured a hurricane, another one, 2 weeks ago. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has been touring different areas that were impacted by Hurricane Milton. Let's take a listen.
The storm was significant, but thankfully this was not the worst case scenario. The storm did weaken before landfall, and the storm surge, as initially reported, has not been as significant overall as what was observed for Hurricane Helene.
Here in Sarasota County, 66% of the homes are without power. 340 people had to be rescued from flooded waters way higher than this. And again, power is a big issue because people cannot access gas stations, therefore no mobility for thousands of residents of this part of Florida.
It's a big mess. We still had the trash that was not picked up, so that had a lot of projectiles flying around. We had some flooding, lost some roofs. Hopefully no loss of life. We're just out here assessing the situation, helping clean out the road and seeing what we can take care of.
Were you expecting it to be worse?
I don't know. It's pretty bad. It's pretty bad. It looks like some areas have taken it harder than others on Siesta Key. But yeah, I'm probably a little relieved.
That was Nitza Soledad Perez reporting there from Florida. Well, for more on the impact of Hurricane Milton, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Boca Raton, Florida, is John Englander. He's an oceanographer, expert on climate change, and the author of Moving to Higher Ground, Rising Sea Level and the Path Forward. Also with us from Miami, Daniel Kreeger is the executive director and co-founder of the Association for Climate Change Officers. Here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio, Joseph Williams is the former senior editor for U.S. News and World Report, and meteorologist Shel Winkley is a weather and climate engagement specialist at Climate Central in Bryan College Station, Texas. Thank you to all of you for being with us. Shel, let me start with you. Hurricane Milton, of course, made landfall near Siesta Key in Florida, as I've been saying, as a Category 3 storm with winds up to 160 kilometers an hour. And we did hear all those warnings from officials before it made landfall, those very dire warnings warning people to get out of the way, to evacuate, or they could be stranded, or in the worst case scenario, they could be killed. But in the end, it seemed that Milton was more bark than bite. It was not as destructive as feared. What's your assessment?
So, a lot of folks have said that today, like, oh, it was weaker than expected, or it wasn't as big as, the devastation that could have come. Maybe that is true, but I think if you ask the folks that are dealing with storm surge today, the almost 3 million people that are still without power across the state of Florida, and the fact that the storm not only made landfall in one spot, but then the winds expanded as far as they did, impacting the state of Florida, there was a lot to it, plus all of the tornado warnings yesterday as well. You have a state that was dealing with storm surge, and you heard about all the debris and trash that was taken out of homes there and then reflooded again. So while some say, oh, well, it wasn't the Category 5 that it was in the Gulf of Mexico, I think if you ask the folks of Florida who had to deal with this almost in back-to-back weeks, and some whose houses were in rough shape and now in even worse shape, they would say that it probably was just as bad as they were anticipating for it to be.
All right, Michelle, where is the storm now headed?
Right. So now it is out in the opening Atlantic. It's actually what we call a post-tropical system. So it interacted with a frontal system. It got picked up by the jet stream. It is still a powerful storm. It just doesn't have the tropical characteristics to it as well. The winds earlier today, even though it wasn't a hurricane or a tropical storm, extended as far as 500 kilometers from the center. So there's still storm surge that's happening on the east coast of Florida. There's still a lot of wind that they're dealing with there on the southeastern coast of the U.S., but it is headed out to sea, and it is now what is technically called a fish storm after it crossed Florida.
All right, you say a post-tropical storm, Shell. Does it still have the potential to cause serious damage?
So right now, really what's left of it in terms of for the United States coastline, it's going to be rough surfs and big swells for a couple of days. But again, it's going to be passing well south of Bermuda, and then that will stay out in the open water. So the biggest and the worst of Milton is done. Now it's on to the cleanup factor of it.
Daniel Kreeger, the United States National Weather Service issued more than 100 tornado warnings before the hurricane made landfall. We do know that there were 19 confirmed tornadoes that reached ground level, touchdown, as they say. And those tornadoes actually have been blamed for a number of deaths in the area. I mean, is this an unusual phenomenon, or was it something that was to be expected?
So I remember in 1992, I lived through Hurricane Andrew, and I remember hearing on the radio there were water spouts and tornado sightings. Historically, with hurricanes, we see tornadoes. We hadn't seen this kind of volume before, and what was really interesting and scary about this one was a lot of those tornadoes were really, really far from where the most destructive winds were in the hurricane system. So in areas where people might have otherwise thought, oh, we're not going to take as big a wind hit here as other areas, they were getting tornadoes, and the tornadoes are far worse than the sustained hurricane winds we were seeing closer to the eye.
So does that make the actual target zone much, much greater?
In this particular case, it really did. And to the point that we just heard, we were really dealing with a hurricane in almost 4 dimensions. We had a storm surge hitting a substantial portion of the coast, worse in some places than others. We had nearly 20 inches of rainfall in just a handful of hours in St. Petersburg. We had these tornadoes hammering areas from Broward County up into Stewart and St. Augustine, I think, where frankly a lot of the housing would not have been durable enough to handle this. And then you have the wind of the sustained winds of the hurricane as well. This was a lot more multifaceted, covering a massive component of the state that frankly I've only seen in the form of Hurricane Irma back in 2017.
Okay, let's go to John. John, good to see you again. Now, the Tampa Bay region is considered one of the most vulnerable metropolitan areas in the United States. We had a record 11 inches of rain that was dumped in Tampa. That's a record, as I said. But the storm did come a little bit south of the city. And, you know, Shell did make the point that for the people there, this was a big storm. They've suffered quite a bit. But still, could it have been much worse?
Oh, absolutely. If that storm surge hadn't moved in the final, whatever it was, 10 hours or so, and if they got just the perfect angle for the moving hurricane pushing a wall of water and catching in that hook that is Tampa Bay, for a while it looked like a really good alignment, and that would have pushed the maximum amount of water up into Tampa Bay and flooded large parts of the city. In the end, the track moved a little bit, you know, over the last 100 miles or so, it was wobbling, as they said. So that's just lucky that it wobbled one way and not the other. But it could have been far more tragic. Mm-hmm. And really, it's just a luck of the draw, if you will, where the wobble goes. Also, these storms that come from west to east, which is not the normal track, if you think about it. The usual storms come across the Atlantic from Africa. I think maybe the models aren't quite as sophisticated as my guess about these tiny little wobbling events and so on. But as bad as it was, we were fortunate.
But John, as you say, the bay itself may have escaped those storm surges, but were there still severe flooding in the south?
Yes, I mean they had like I think they talked like 6 or 7 feet in some areas. I have friends who have live on a sailboat, and it rode the storm out. They had evacuated, but this one and barely with the last one with Helene last week or 10 days ago, I guess it was. They didn't sustain any damage to their boat, but those storm surges are very difficult to prepare for. They're going to rip boats apart and throw them against the marina walls and create havoc. But the worst was avoided by luck.
Joseph, great to have you with us in the studio in person. This is the second time Florida has been hit by a storm in almost 2 weeks, and it's the third storm to actually make landfall in the state. Now, the United States Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is known as FEMA, they're involved in recovery efforts right now, not just in Florida, they're also involved in North Carolina, where Hurricane Helene caused very serious damage. That was just a couple of weeks ago. What can you tell us about the government response to these?
Well, so far the government response has been fairly adequate. It's been adequate to good, depending on who you talk to. The administration says the response has been very excellent. They've had people on the ground within 48 hours of Helene after that event took place, which was almost unexpected because there was a lot of flooding happening in a western part of the state that doesn't normally get that. So that response, I think, was fairly adequate to good. The response to Milton so far is to be determined, mainly because there are a lot of reports that FEMA is running out of cash. And Congress has to come back and reallocate some funds. Now, they have enough to operate on the ground right now, but coming ahead and dealing with 2 hurricanes at the same time, basically, essentially, 2 hurricane recovery events at the same time, it's going to require Congress to take some action, and we always know that that's kind of difficult, especially that you have a lot of rumors swirling around that FEMA is mismanaging the money and that that's going to be a problem. So everyone has to get on the same page, but so far, so good. I think most people would agree.
Right, and those rumors, we want to talk about them a little bit later. It's being called disinformation right now. Congress coming back, they are making some efforts to come back. I heard that the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, is calling members back.
Yes, and well, he should, because this is kind of an unprecedented event. Normally, they would have time to wait, but 2 back-to-back storms with precipitous recovery and loss of life, Congress can't ignore that. The problem is going to be about how much money they're going to allocate. Congress has always had a problem in setting a firm figure for spending. It's always better in these sorts of situations to ask for more money than less, lest you be here again. But we don't know, and we all know that Congress has had a hard time at agreeing, the Republicans and the Democrats and the White House, agreeing on what that set figure should be, and we're not completely out of hurricane season just yet.
Shel, what role is climate change playing in these increasingly stronger storms that we're seeing right now? There was a report that one of the reasons Hurricane Milton got to a Category 5 storm was because of very warm surface water over the Gulf.
Yeah, that's right. So what we can do to understand really what the role is, hurricanes have a lot of different aspects that, come into play when is it going to become a big storm? Milton at the end had some wind shear knocking at it. But what we know, what Climate Central has done is actually put out what we call attribution science. We can now really understand in terms of a likelihood that a temperature of the sea surface is because of climate change. So if you look at the area that Milton developed and then rapidly intensified on Monday, using what we know, using that science in our climate models, we can understand that climate change made the anomalously warm waters over the Western Gulf anywhere from 400 to 800 times more likely because of human-caused climate change. So basically what that means is that the waters in that part of the Gulf at this time of the year in early October being that anomalously hot almost would have been virtually impossible without some sort of fingerprint of climate change with it.
Right, John, what are your thoughts on that? There's even now talk of creating another category, a Category 6. What does that mean?
Well, the classic scales for hurricane assessment, there's the Saffir-Simpson scale, and it's based upon wind damage. And we're realizing that as the oceans warm and we get these strange storms, if you will, which would extraordinary amounts of water in the system, that the rain damage also needs to be considered. So that discussion really is how to put out a rating system that the public can easily understand, and yet how to have more than one variable of wind speed in it.
One other thing, John, when Hurricane Helene made landfall in the Panhandle in Florida, it dumped an enormous amount of debris, tons of debris, in fact. Most of it has been removed. There were, I think, something like 3,000 truckloads of debris that was removed from there, but a lot still remains. And what kinds of risks or dangers does that pose?
Well, that was the fear with this storm this week, that the debris from last week, as you say, everything from building materials and washing machines and boats and things like that would get hurled by the winds and become even bigger projectiles. And there was a lot of effort at state and federal levels and local, I think, to remove as much of that debris as possible. And as you cited, I think in most places they did pretty well, but there was a lot of debris to be flung around.
Daniel, I want to get back to Hurricane Ian that hit near Fort Myers in Florida. That was in 2022. It caused more than $50 billion damage. We know that tourism is critical to the Florida economy. So what kind of impact, do these storms have on a state like Florida? And of course, they also have that knock-on effect, because if we talk about the movement of gasoline supplies and things like that, it could affect other states. It could affect large parts of the country.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, Florida's an economy that's driven by its service industries. So your hospitality, your hotels, your restaurants, and all of these are substantially hurting from these events. You've got the damages to structures, and there's that cost. I think we often underestimate and overlook the disruption cost to these businesses as well. We're just entering in Florida. We're just entering into the season. This is the season where folks from up north come down to Florida to enjoy the more moderate weather, if you will, that doesn't seem so moderate in other ways. That now is off the table for so many of these businesses. The length of time to recover is substantial. And even if the business itself wasn't disrupted, the surrounding area might be, and that becomes a problem too. So we've seen areas like Captiva Island been devastated from these past events and don't really have the same sort of economic capabilities they did before. Service industry is a factor. Your supply chains are getting disrupted, getting fuel and other key supplies across roadways and critical systems is a disruption factor. Anything that's based on real estate value is substantially going to be impacted. Residential services. Now, there's some boom that comes when insurance dollars come back in some areas, as the insurance industry used to say in a weird way, a little bit of disaster can be good for the economy. But those studies were based on a single system hitting and the influx of money coming in. What that same industry ultimately found was when the same area keeps getting hit by those systems, the recovery actually never gets back to what it was. And that's what these areas now are facing. It's not just multiple times in the last few weeks. Mm-hmm. It's a sequence of events that's been happening year over year over year that they're trying to rebound from. And that loses a lot of confidence. So the private sector is absolutely substantially impacted by this.
Right, and I presume, Daniel, that it's going to be quite some time before all those people who have evacuated, and there are tens of thousands of them, would be able to return.
Yeah, well, so every area is going to have a different sort of recovery time frame. As an example, in 2017, when Hurricane Irma came up through the state of Florida, my parents' home took 3.5 feet of water through it. It was a month before they could return home because there was no power anywhere in their neighborhood. And then on top of it, once they got back home, the first floor of their home was compromised. You're going to be dealing with that sort of circumstance in some areas. In other areas, the damage may not be as debilitating to being able to get back to where they are. And we're looking at, as again, those 4 dimensions of impacts that we were talking about. In the areas that took as much as 10 feet of surge, those areas, that recovery is much longer. Nothing withstands 10 feet of water or 5 feet of water. Those areas are substantially compromised. In the areas that took heavy rainfall, you might see a little faster recovery if that rainfall didn't create that kind of flooding. The wind areas seem to not be as bad because, to the points that were made earlier, what we were looking at is a Cat 5 destructive storm ended up being a Cat 3. So difference in sustained winds, instead of seeing 165, 175 sustained winds with wind gusts in the 200s, we were seeing low hundreds. That, I guess, is fortunate relative to what it could have been. To John's point, very lucky in that regard, not so lucky overall.
Joseph, one of the other things that's happened is that this storm that we're seeing, this tragedy that we're seeing, really has become politicized. Of course, we shouldn't be surprised in this current political climate, but it's been politicized. Donald Trump and his running mate, J.D. Vance, have been pushing, a debunked narrative. I call it misinformation or disinformation earlier on. Vance actually wrote an opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal, and I'm going to quote directly from that piece. This is what he said. Under Ms. Harris and President Biden, FEMA has funneled millions of dollars to non-governmental organizations whose stated goal is facilitating mass migration into the United States. The effort stems from a White House directive to reorient FEMA's institutional focus away from U.S. citizens and toward aliens who either have no legal right to be here or whose legal status depends on the say-so of the Biden-Harris administration. Now, President Biden has responded to that. He's accused Trump and Vance of spreading outright lies. Let's listen to some of what the president had to say.
Over the last few weeks, there's been a reckless and irresponsible and relentless promotion of disinformation and outright lies about what's going on. It's undermining confidence in the people in Florida. An incredible rescue and recovery work that has been undertaken. Literally, there are thousands of fellow Americans who are putting their lives at stake and putting on the line to do the dangerous work that needs to be done now. And it's harmful to those who most need the help. Quite frankly, these lies are un-American, and there is simply no place for them. Not now, not ever.
So, as we heard the president say there, we're hearing these things, this kind of disinformation, and it's undermining the confidence and efforts of people in Florida. I mean, how does this complicate things?
Greatly. First and foremost, you have a whole region of the country, two regions, in fact, that are struggling and trying to get on their feet. No matter how you slice it, recovery, it always takes longer than you want it to, especially if you're in those circumstances. So that makes it much more, you're much more receptive and much more vulnerable to rumors, to misinformation, to outright lies, as the president said. And this complicates things because FEMA has a job to do and people are insisting that they're not doing it. And it also troubles the waters as far as the immigration concern is concerned, mainly because you have a opposition party where the two leaders of those parties are spreading misinformation because they think that immigration is their winning issue. So it complicates in terms of getting enough money. It complicates in terms of morale on the ground and how patient people are going to be in terms of recovery. We had that whole rumor about $700 was all that we're going to get, but when in fact that was a direct cash payment that was the first of what's likely to be many. So it has a range of ripple effects, almost like in the four dimensions that we were talking about the hurricane, in confidence in government, in patience for the recovery, in confidence in FEMA, and in the ability to get for the two parties to come together to get enough money to have this recovery happen. And it's going to be a long recovery, make no mistake. Like your previous guest, I was in Andrew in '92 in Florida, and it took months for people to get back on their feet. And even then, people were still running out of patience and running out of time and running out of money. Just as the tourism season is starting, school is underway, it's going to disrupt a whole range of systems, and people are going to be blaming the government for that when it's really not the government's fault necessarily.
Right, now, Joseph, you say it's going to have a ripple effect. Could that ripple effect extend to the election? Could it have an impact on the election?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because you've got people in North Carolina, they're setting them up to vote absentee. We already have had the Republicans talk about absentee ballots are areas of fraud.
Right.
The whole Donald Trump fraud scheme, his notion of how fraud is permeating every aspect of the election is very much going to be at play here because people are going to be suspicious. They're going to be ready to challenge in court. Already these challenges are probably being teed up as we speak. election irregularities in these hard-hit areas. People may not even be voting because they might be so discouraged or more focused on recovering their property and their housing than participating in the electoral process. It becomes a matter of priority. So it's going to complicate things a lot, especially since two of the hit states, Florida and Georgia, or rather North Carolina and Georgia, are swing states that are crucial to the outcome of this election.
Right. Shell, October is historically an active month for hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, as well as the southeast part of the United States, that coastline there. So, as someone pointed out earlier on, this is just the beginning. What's the outlook for the rest of this hurricane season?
So as of right now, you've got another tropical storm. It was a hurricane earlier. It's named Leslie. Now it's down to a tropical storm. That will stay in the Atlantic. There's a tropical wave coming off the coast of Africa, but that also at this point has no implications for the United States coast. Very important. We're talking about misinformation that's been going around for the past few days on social media. Right. There's been a lot of posts using old forecasts of other storms that have happened in the past, trying to pass it off as another tropical system hitting the United States. At this point, we do not see that. It is still very possible. In fact, if you look at some of the very extended forecast models, sure, it does occasionally pick up on a possibility of another tropical system in the Gulf of Mexico. But like any tropical modeling we talked about a little bit earlier, this far out, it's all smoke and mirrors. So at this point, there's no impact to the United States that we're looking at from a tropical system. And really, hurricane season goes until November 30th. We've seen active seasons where, the Hurricane Center has been drawing up forecasts for storms way out in the Eastern Atlantic on the very last day of the year. But what's important to know is that as we get into these fall months, as we start seeing weather systems crossing the country, cold fronts sweeping across the U.S., a lot of times any sort of tropical system that can form will get swept off or shunted from the United States because of those fronts and usually stay out of over open water. So I can't 100% say that there's not going to be another tropical system that impacts somewhere along the United States coast. It's something to be seen. But usually the climatology starts to shift more towards the Atlantic and maybe even just something to monitor for the eastern side of the U.S., at least for a storm to come close enough that may kick up those swells and cause some issues on beaches specifically.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. We have run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.